And thank you everybody who came tonight and who hopefully will see us tomorrow at 1 o'clock for the organizer and planning meeting for the April 13th protest. If you haven't done organizing before, haven't been involved in building the demonstration, come tomorrow and you can get on the ground floor. If you've never done it, it's a learning experience, but everybody's welcome and we need everyone to help for this important activity. I want to say, when I start, a little bit about why we published this book, The Socialists and War, Two Opposing Trends. It's an unusual book for the PSL because it takes up a debate that's going on not simply between us and the Pentagon or us and the 1% or us and Wall Street. It takes up a debate between the PSL and others in the socialist and anti-war movement. And in that sense, the book is a polemic. It's a sharply worded polemic. And we don't normally do it because of the many things that divide or separate different progressive people. We have a great deal in common with each other. And we emphasize almost always, let's work together in spite of whatever our political differences are. And we emphasize that. We need to do that too because the movement is still in the sort of embryonic stage, in the beginning stage. It's at a point where we don't want to have a relatively small movement mainly fighting with itself or struggling with itself, especially when the oppressive forces of the capitalist system are so great, their power is seemingly so vast, their resources to manipulate and mold public opinion seemingly without end, seemingly in a limitless way. They control the airwaves, they control the mass media, their voice, their message about their own war plans or their own economic policies. That's what dominates. So most of our argument is with the powers that be. But this is an argument within the socialist movement, and we think it's important enough, obviously, that we published a book about it, a small pamphlet. And we hope that at the end of tonight's meeting, everyone does buy the book here. You can buy something on ebook too if you want, but buy this book because in addition to reading it, taking notes with it, if you have feedback about it, we'd like to hear it. We'd also like you to show it to your friends and families and co-students and co-workers, especially where people are debating the issue. Now, the focus is, we said, two opposing trends. And the polemic is against the International Socialist Organization, ISO, and another wing of the Occupy movement called, well, it's an individual named Phan Binh. He calls himself the leadership of the class war tendency of the Occupy movement. But the polemic is about this. In the case of the war against Libya, waged by NATO, carrying out massive bombings against the country of Libya, designed to overthrow the government of Muammar Gaddafi and the Green Movement, like the war that's being carried out, the civil war that's being carried out against the Syrian government, these organizations are basically on the same side as the US and the Pentagon and the CIA in that they support the ouster, the destruction of those governments. And we, on the other hand, organized, as you all know, or those of you who knew us at that time in 2011, in the middle of the bombing campaign against Libya, a militant nationwide response against the bombing of Libya and in defense of the existing Libyan government, the government that had been targeted for destruction. And today, the United States government, while it has not started the bombing of Syria, is sending weapons and money and all sorts of military and logistical assistance to the rebel forces who are trying to overthrow the government in Syria, in Damascus. In the popular presentation, and this is a presentation that's echoed largely by the other leftists who support the overthrow of these governments, the presentation is that there is the dictatorship, represented in the case of Libya by Gaddafi, and then the people who are oppressed by the dictatorship. And isn't it just natural that you would support a people rising up against a dictatorship? Dictatorship is synonymous with oppression, with the absence of democratic rights, the absence of civil liberties, extreme and absolute power represented by the dictator, and the people, when they rise up, are fighting for something good. And that those who are leading the rebellion, in the case of Libya against Gaddafi, or today in Syria against Assad, against the Assad government, are revolutionaries. And we as revolutionaries should support those revolutionaries. And on its face, especially since the presentation in the popular media is that it is a struggle between the masses of people against the dictator, how could it be that we, socialists, revolutionaries, are supporting the dictator and opposing the masses of people who are revolting, who are in stage of revolution and rebellion? That's how it's presented. And our position, as you know, and as you think about, is clearly a minority position, because everything you read in the Washington Post and in the New York Times, or watch on CNN, or watch on ABC, fortifies the presentation of the question, dictator versus people, people led by the revolution. So that's kind of what we're up against, because that's the presentation. And we consider the presentation to be fundamentally false and concealing the reality of what went on in Libya and what's going on today in Syria. And we can look back and see over the course of the last 2 decades, but really for the past century, that this kind of division within the socialist or progressive or anti-war movement has happened not simply in Libya or Syria, but has happened, in fact, in almost every war for the past 100 years, where a certain section of the socialist movement ends up supporting the government, its government, the government that represents the capitalists, as they wage war against another country or many countries. So the question is, why does it keep happening? Why does this pattern repeat itself over and over again? I'll give you a couple examples that are from recent history, so it's easier for us to grasp. At the beginning of the Iraq War, at the beginning of the first Gulf War, which was in January 1991, there was a sequence of events that I want to explain for those of you who weren't present, and some of you weren't even born. So I'm just going to take a minute to do that. In August 2nd, 1990, the Iraqi government invaded Kuwait, a small country that sort of landlocks Iraq towards the Persian-Arabian Gulf. Kuwait is led by a familial monarchy. It was a creation of British imperialism. It was really the port city and port state of old Iraq, taken over by British colonialism, just as the British took over Hong Kong in China and created a British colony there. The Iraqis always viewed Kuwait the way the Chinese viewed Hong Kong, as something stolen.
That's right.
Something stolen by the British. As a matter of fact, when the Iraqi Revolution happened against the British monarchy, the British-backed monarchy in 1958, President Eisenhower sent 10,000 troops to Lebanon, and the British sent 10,000 troops into Kuwait to make it clear to the Arab people that the democratic revolution that took place in Iraq was not going to spread into Kuwait, that that was British and British-American property, nor would it spread into Lebanon, which was also considered basically the property of European colonialists at that time. They rushed the troops there not to protect Kuwaitis, but to protect British and American interests, and the same in Lebanon. Now, in 1990, Iraq and Kuwait had been having a formidable dispute over a number of issues, and Iraq invaded Kuwait and overthrew the Kuwaiti monarchy. And the first Bush administration, George Herbert Walker Bush, said in order to defend Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, the U.S. would immediately send 500,000 troops to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Now that surprised Saddam Hussein, who thought that the overthrow of the Kuwaiti monarchy would lead to a negotiated settlement by the Arab League. But the Americans didn't want to have a negotiated settlement. They were preparing for a new war against Iraq. Now a lot of people thought, well, why would they want to have a war against Iraq? During the 1980s, the United States worked with Saddam Hussein to carry out the war against Iran after Iran had a revolution in 1979, the Iran-Iraq War. And for 8 years, the United States government gave money and guns to both Iran and Iraq. As Henry Kissinger cynically put it, we were hoping that they would both kill each other. In other words, a cynical manipulation where the two main regional powers that had oil and water and a large population and a significant military, in other words, countries that could be a regional power challenging U.S. domination in this oil-rich and geostrategically important part of the world, if they fought each other, if they fought each other, they wouldn't fight the United States. They would exhaust their revolutionary potential by a struggle between them. And the U.S. egged both sides on, but particularly the Iraqi side. And at the end of the Iraq War, the Iran-Iraq War, was at the same time that the Soviet Union and the governments of Eastern Europe were collapsing. And the United States, recognizing that the principal allies of the Iraqi government and the Syrian government and the Iranian government and all of the nationalist, anti-imperialist governments in the Middle East, recognizing that the Soviet leadership was collapsing or trying to accommodate itself, Gorbachev in the last years of the administration, to the designs of U.S. imperialism in the Middle East, the U.S. was looking for a pretext to go to war against Iraq because they believed that the Soviet Union would no longer defend its allies in the Third World. And of course, soon the Soviet Union collapsed, and there was no Soviet power to defend allies in the Third World, nationalist, anti-colonial regimes in the Third World. Now, when Iraq invaded Kuwait and Bush sent 500,000 troops, he said, we are going to defend Kuwait's freedom. Now, Saddam Hussein immediately seized the passports of all the foreigners who were living in Iraq at the time, including Americans. And the American media said, Saddam Hussein takes hostages. Now, Saddam was figuring if the Westerners, including the Americans, couldn't leave Iraq, then the U.S. wouldn't bomb Iraq. So they felt, well, by taking their passports, that would become a deterrent to the war. But the U.S. said, and I don't know, for those of you who are old enough, you can remember, there were picture after picture after picture of hostages in Iraq. And Saddam Hussein had become the great monster. And everything you read in the American media was demonizing Saddam Hussein as if Saddam Hussein was Adolf Hitler reincarnated. Everybody learned that the thing you must do first when you wake up is pledge your hatred or fear and hatred of Saddam Hussein. And nobody could say anything except how bad and evil Saddam Hussein was. The campaign of demonization was almost unmatched in recent history in terms of the way the media created a hatred for the Iraqi government. Now, those of us who eventually formed the Answer Coalition, who organized these massive demonstrations against the Iraq War, we were active at that time, and we started organizing demonstrations against what we said would be a new war against the Iraqi people in the Middle East, not because negotiations were impossible, but because the United States decided it wanted a war. And we started to have massive demonstrations, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000. Like within 2 months, young people, workers, poor people, everybody was uniting in a huge anti-war coalition in the fall of 1990. I went with, at that time, on a delegation that we organized actually to Iraq with Muhammad Ali, the boxer, and others who were famous sort of figures in the civil rights and black liberation movement, went to Iraq and said, look, let's talk to Iraq. Why have a war? Why the race towards war? Why not a negotiated settlement? And there were meetings, and Saddam Hussein, you know, made statements that they were prepared for a negotiated settlement. I walked into the I'll just tell you one quick story about that, interesting story I thought. I walked into the Al Rashid Hotel, which is their 5-star hotel, and everybody was having this giant kind of banquet, and it was like all these white people. And I said, there's so much media here, and they're all eating so well. We had been on the road for a few days, and one of the people who was accompanying us said, oh, this isn't media, these are the hostages. So I said, what? They said, yeah, these are all the European hostages. They're eating at this 5-star hotel in this giant banquet. And I said, I don't believe it. So I went to one of the tables and I said, are you hostages? And a group of Irish nurses who were present said, yes, we're the hostages and we're going out to a club later on. Would you like to come? It was kind of... This is too low. It was kind of mind-blowing because the image in the media, Saddam has all the hostages put away into dark, dank, you know, quarters, and here they're eating these giant banquet-style meals and going to bars afterwards. And when I talked to them, I said, well, you know, there's going to be a war here. Are you worried? And they said, oh no, there won't be a war. There won't be a war. This is easy to negotiate. I said, no, there's going to be a war because the U.S. doesn't send 500,000 troops somewhere to negotiate. They're sending 500,000 troops because they're preparing to bomb and invade this country. And anyway, just by way of the demonization thing, like how out of kilter it was with what was going on. So we organizing these big demonstrations, and suddenly on the media, when we're in front of the media, on CNN, Fox News, which was then a kind of a nowhere station, so they even had us on. It was just getting started. After a couple times where we talked about our demonstrations, people would say, well, what do you think about Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait? And we would say, this is not about the invasion of Kuwait. That could have been negotiated. The U.S. is looking for a pretext because it wants to go to war against Iraq, and it has nothing to do with Saddam Hussein. And they said, well, don't you condemn the invasion of Kuwait? We're on TV now, so... And we wouldn't say yes. And the reason we wouldn't say yes is because if you say yes, we condemn the invasion of Kuwait, the next question that you get is, okay, then what do you think the U.S. should be doing if it shouldn't be invading and bombing Iraq? What's your solution? So what is our solution? Well, a split happened inside the anti-war coalition at that time. And the one anti-war coalition became two anti-war coalitions. Almost identical to what happened in the Iraq War, where the Answer Coalition was organizing mass demonstrations, and then a second group formed, a group called United for Peace and Justice, UFPJ, and it's almost the same people who were involved in the split that happened in the anti-war movement in 1991 and the one that happened in 2003. And the people who split away said, by not condemning Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, you, Brian, and the other people in this coalition, the other leaders, appear to and will be accused of by the media of being apologists for Saddam Hussein. You'll be treated as if you're just an extension or a mouthpiece for the Saddam Hussein government. And that's a dictatorship, and that government did invade Kuwait, and that was a violation of Kuwait's self-determination. So we're not going to agree with you. We're going to split away from that coalition. We're going to form our own coalition. And what we're going to do is say we condemn Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, and we also oppose any war against Iraq. So now we have a moral and ethical position that is, unlike your position, quite pure. We condemn oppression and violence on both sides. Doesn't matter if it's coming from the US or from Iraq. We have achieved true piety, a pure position. Okay, that sounds pretty good. Why not be with the pure group instead of the impure group? But then the question is, if you go on TV and you say, yes, I condemn Kuwait, the invasion of Kuwait, but I don't want a war against Iraq, the next question is, and was posed to them, well, what are you for? So they came up with an idea. They said, we're for economic sanctions as a non-violent show of resistance against Iraq's bad behavior. So they chanted. We had two different demonstrations. We couldn't demonstrate it on the same day. On January 19th, 1991, 4 days after the war started, our coalition had about 75,000 people, very multinational, multiracial, very militant. And the next week, the Pure Coalition had a demonstration that was quite a bit bigger than ours. We were about 75,000, they were about 200,000. They were led by American flags, and they were chanting, sanctions not war, sanctions not war, sanctions not war. So they got part of their program. The US did impose economic sanctions, and they continued to impose economic sanctions on Iraq all the way up until the invasion in 2003. And during that entire time, according to the United Nations' own statistics, 8,000 Iraqis died every month because of the absence of food or medicine. They died from treatable diseases. 5,000 of the 8,000 were babies, and the other 3,000 were their grandparents. In other words, the most vulnerable sectors of society for whom, if you deprive them of food and medicine or clean drinking water, they die. Maybe the people in between can eke out a life. But according to the United Nations, according to UNESCO, 5,000 Iraqi babies died who would not have died otherwise because of economic sanctions. Now, Iraq can't sanction the United States. Iran can't sanction the United States. Venezuela can't sanction the United States. Cuba can't blockade the United States. The poor, the oppressed, the formerly colonized countries, the weaker economies, weaker not because they're less fruitful or less hardworking, but because they have the legacy of colonialism, they can't put economic sanctions on the powerful imperialist countries. Economic sanctions are a tool of the powerful against the less powerful or against the weak. And so by being afraid to be against the United States' demonization of Iraq, you had a section of the anti-war movement chanting for economic sanctions, which were, while made them feel pure for a moment, and made them be able to answer those tough questions on TV with a way that said, no, we're not for Saddam, we're against all war. They contributed to the genocide against the Iraqi people. When you kill 8,000 people a month for 10 years, that's genocide. Genocide is the destruction of a people in whole or in part simply for who they are. Those Iraqi babies died because they were Iraqi babies, not because they hurt somebody. And Madeleine Albright, who was the Secretary of State, and then the UN ambassador, and then the Secretary of State during Clinton, when she was asked by Leslie Stahl on television, she said, you know, 500,000 babies died in Iraq from our economic sanctions. Is the price worth it? And Madeleine Albright said, well, that's a tough question, but yes, the price is worth it. Really? Now, later, some of these anti-war forces started campaigns against economic sanctions when they could see that all these babies were dying. But it didn't matter later. It mattered at the time. It mattered at the time. In other words, the desire to go along with the ruling class and its propaganda and its presentation, and not to associate with the unpopular, demonized target of the United States, put the anti-war movement seemingly in a pure position, but really in an irrelevant position. Because they adopted part of the program of imperialism, which was to impose economic sanctions. Sanctions are not an alternative to war, they are war. They are part of an integrated, coordinated strategy of war by the powerful, by the imperialists against the oppressed. Now, we didn't agree with Saddam Hussein. Matter of fact, before that episode, myself and Liz and other people who were active politically at the time, we were organizing demonstrations in support of the Kurds of Iraq against some of the brutal treatment they received by the Saddam Hussein government. But that was at a time when the U.S. government was supporting Saddam Hussein in its struggle against Iran. The reason that there are two opposing trends is that there's two different orientations, not towards dictatorship, but towards imperialism, towards our own government. We are not for dictatorship. We are not the apologists of Assad or Gaddafi, but we have to also tell the truth. Under Gaddafi, it wasn't a gray totalitarian nightmare. It wasn't the people against Gaddafi. It was some sectors of the people against Gaddafi, and many sectors of the Libyan society defended Gaddafi. On July 1st, 2011, 800,000 or maybe 1 million people demonstrated in Tripoli. And they demonstrated in support of Gaddafi and against the NATO bombing of their country. You can't stage manage a million person demonstrations and tell everybody, oh, if you don't go, the dictator will really be mad at you tomorrow, so you got to show up. Can't do that. Also, when the bombing was happening and the so-called revolutionaries who were working with NATO, and NATO was helping them, what did Gaddafi do to defend his government? There are arms depots all over Tripoli and all over Libya. The Gaddafi government opened up those armed depots and told the people, take weapons and use them to defend our country against the NATO forces and against the counter-revolutionaries who are working with them. If you're a dictator and all the people hate you, you don't try to arm everybody. You don't say, if you're a dictator who's completely isolated from the mass of the people, you don't tell them, get guns, and here they are. Because you would use the guns against the dictator. The so-called dictator obviously had a significant base of popular support within Libya, but the American people don't know it because CNN isn't saying, hey, 1 million people demonstrated for Gaddafi yesterday. They don't say that at all. If they talked about it, it was to show, they'd say some stage-managed rally took place of 1 million people, and they said, well, some said it was more than 100,000. Or like that demonstration, which was 500,000 that we organized. The first reports from the New York Times were thousands demonstrated. Well, technically true, there were thousands, but there were 500,000, so you might have used another number to aptly describe the crowd. When we protested enough, the New York Times redid the article, but that was, a week later. But they're manipulating the presentation. In the case of Syria, there are many, many enemies of the Assad government. Many. And many of them have very valid grievances. And there are other people in Syria who support the Assad government. There are religious differences, there are regional differences, there are sectoral differences. The fact that you can get large numbers of people to come out in opposition to the government doesn't mean that they speak for all the people. I mean, after Obama came into office, I mean, I went to Tea Party rallies, not to participate, but to spy on them. And it didn't go over that well because they realized who we were, so we had to leave quickly. But they had hundreds of thousands of people there. Hundreds of thousands. If you took a snapshot and said hundreds of thousands of people demonstrate against Obama, you would think, okay, the American people, if that's the presentation somewhere, the American people are standing up against Obama. Well, some were. Some of them went to town hall meetings and brought guns. Now, North Korea is embargoed, it's sanctioned, it's got the biggest military power in the world, calling it crazy, saying as they did under Bush that it was like with Iraq and Iran, the axis of evil, staging mock invasions and mock bombing campaigns, and they set off a third nuclear test to say, unlike Iraq, we're not going to disarm, we're going to keep our arms and build new ones in order to deter aggression. And then you read the newspaper and say, there's those North Korean wild men, crazy people, and you know what? A section of the U.S. anti-war movement will say, well, we condemn North Korea, we don't want a war, but we condemn North Korea for having a nuclear test. Well, no, we're not going to do that. Because if the U.S. doesn't want Korea to have nuclear tests, it should sign a peace treaty, it should lift the economic sanctions, it should stop carrying out war games simulating the invasion and bombing of that country, which poses no threat to the American people. And if under those circumstances, and with those circumstances, North Korea would probably be very glad to stop producing nuclear bombs and instead use that money to feed people and to provide clothes and shelter and the things that they, like all governments, would want. When Clinton was close to coming to normalization of relations with North Korea in the last months of the Clinton administration in 2000, they sent representatives to Pyongyang. The North Koreans said, we're going to suspend our nuclear weapons program. They did suspend their nuclear weapons program. When Bush came into office, he immediately scotched all that and said, no, there's not going to be any normalization. You're an evil empire. You're part of the axis of evil. We invaded Iraq, threatening Iran. We're going to probably invade you. North Korea said, okay, we drop out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They kicked out the weapons inspectors, and they began building nuclear weapons and telling everybody, guess what? We have nuclear weapons. Exactly. Because they wanted to make it quite clear that North Korea, unlike Iraq, will have nuclear weapons. How many nuclear-armed countries have been invaded since World War II? The answer to that would be 0. So if you're North Korea, and under these circumstances, there's a definite logic and rationale. So when we get on TV or organized demonstrations and people say, well, don't you disagree with North Korea having a nuclear test? Isn't that menacing? We're going to say, you know, actually, and then say all the things that I just said a moment ago. In other words, not go along, not acquiesce, not capitulate to the public pressure created by those who want war and who are demonizing their targets so that we won't resist. If you want to resist the war makers, you have to resist. And if it becomes unpopular for a moment, who cares? I mean, you know, like I think Eugene said it, when we started the Answer Coalition on September 14, 2001, and we said, let's protest against Bush's coming war plans. That was 3 days after World Trade Center and the Pentagon bombing. The smoke was still coming out of those buildings. And when we did that, all the liberals attacked us and said, this is not the time to protest. You know, you're going to be accused of being a friend Al-Qaeda. And it was so hard. People spat upon us. And the liberal group said, don't come to our march. You know, like it brings discredit. But 25,000 mainly young people did come out 18 days later on September 29, 2001. And within a year, a massive anti-war movement started. If we had listened to those who said, don't be unpopular, don't be isolated, we would have never started that anti-war coalition. We have to, whether it comes to Syria, Libya, Korea, or wherever, we have to know that the source of war is not with the targeted country, but with our own imperialist ruling class. And that concludes my talk.